The New Mexico desert, a vast expanse of sun-scorched earth and rolling dunes, a place where time itself seems to stretch and bake under the relentless sun. It is here, in the heart of this stark beauty, that the White Sands Missile Range was born. For decades, it has been the epicenter of America's most advanced and secretive rocketry experiments, a place where the nation reached for the stars. But buried beneath the thunder of engine tests and the whispers of classified operations lies a secret far stranger than any man-made technology, a secret that began in the quiet hush of the 1950s. During those tense years of the Cold War, the atmosphere at the range was electric with discovery and paranoia. One of the many brilliant minds working within this crucible of innovation was Dr. Edward Richards, a young, ambitious physicist with an obsession for the nature of time. He wasn't just watching rockets fly. He was searching for fractures in the fabric of reality itself, tiny glitches that might betray the universe's deepest secrets. His colleagues found him a bit eccentric, a dreamer in a world of rigid equations, but his intellect was undeniable. On a blistering July afternoon in 1953, during a top-secret launch, something went wrong. Not a malfunction of the rocket or a deviation from its trajectory. For a single shimmering moment, at the peak of the engine's thrust, witnesses reported a strange ripple in the air above the launch pad. It was like heat haze, but with a structure, a visible distortion that bent the light around it. Instruments recorded a massive, instantaneous spike in an unidentifiable energy signature. And then, nothing. The launch proceeded as if the event had never occurred, but Dr. Richards knew he had seen something impossible. In the weeks that followed, Richards became consumed. He spent countless sleepless nights poring over the data, rereading instrument printouts. In his private journals, hidden carefully from the prying eyes of his superiors, he began to form an incredible hypothesis. The test had accidentally generated a momentary rift in space-time, a brief, uncontrolled tear. More disturbingly, he suspected something had passed through the rift before it sealed. Not debris from the future or an echo from the past, but something other, something that didn't belong. He tried to voice his concerns to Project Command, but was met with stern skepticism and a clear order to drop his fantasies. The military had no tolerance for loose ends or unexplainable phenomena that could jeopardize their tightly controlled narrative of progress. Dr. Richards, frustrated and deeply unsettled, was forced to continue his investigation in the shadows, knowing he had stumbled upon a truth so profound, its revelation could have consequences beyond his imagination. He didn't know it then, but his obsession was a seed, planted in the desert sands, waiting for a generation to pass before its strange and terrifying fruits would begin to bloom. 70 years passed. The world changed. The frantic pace of the Cold War gave way to a new era of digital connection and quiet suburban life. Dr. Edward Richards lived a long, distinguished, yet troubled life. His groundbreaking work in theoretical physics forever shadowed by the secret he kept locked away in his journals. He passed away peacefully, taking his impossible story, it seemed, to the grave. His legacy fell to his only grandson, a quiet, intellectually curious young man named Ben Richards. Ben was not a physicist. He was an archivist, a man who found comfort in the tangible, ordered world of the past. After his grandfather's death, he inherited the old family home in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a sleepy town that lived in the long shadow of the White Sands Missile Range. The house was a time capsule, filled with books, papers, and the lingering presence of a man Ben had known more as a quiet, distant figure than a grandfather. It was during the slow process of sorting through his grandfather's belongings that the glitches began. They were small things at first, easily dismissed. A clock on the wall that would suddenly jump forward an hour, only to correct itself moments later. A glass of water on the kitchen counter that would ripple as if disturbed, though no one had touched it. Ben chalked it up to the old house's quirks, to faulty wiring or his own tired mind. But the incidents grew stranger, more frequent. One evening, while watching the local news, the broadcast stuttered. For a few seconds, the image on the screen was replaced by a grainy black-and-white shot of the same news anchor, but younger, wearing the styles of a bygone decade, reporting on a story from the past. Then, just as quickly, the image snapped back to the present. The glitches weren't confined to Ben's house. Reports began to surface around Alamogordo. People spoke of conversations that would inexplicably loop, repeating the last few seconds of dialogue. Drivers on the highway would experience brief moments of disorientation, finding themselves 100 yards further down the road than they were a moment before, with no memory of the intervening time. The town's digital infrastructure seemed particularly vulnerable. ATMs would dispense money from transactions that hadn't happened yet. Traffic lights would cycle through their patterns in a fraction of a second. The townsfolk, accustomed to the strange hum of military activity from the nearby range, dismissed it as some new form of electronic interference. But Ben felt a growing unease. These weren't random malfunctions. They felt connected. They were echoes, ripples in the fabric of their quiet lives. He started to wonder about his grandfather, the brilliant, secretive man who had spent his life staring into the desert, looking for secrets. It was then, while clearing out a dusty, locked footlocker in the attic, that Ben found them, a collection of worn, leather-bound journals, filled with his grandfather's elegant, precise handwriting, detailing a story that would unravel everything Ben thought he knew about his world.
The attic was hot and still, the only light coming from a single bare bulb that cast long, dancing shadows across a lifetime of forgotten things. Ben sat on the dusty floorboards, the first of his grandfather's journals open in his lap. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages within were filled with a dense, looping script, interspersed with complex equations and hand-drawn diagrams that made Ben's head spin. He started reading, expecting dry academic entries about rocket propulsion and theoretical physics. But as he delved deeper, a different story began to unfold. It was a story of obsession, of a secret that had haunted his grandfather for 70 years. Ben's eyes scanned the pages, his initial curiosity slowly morphing into a sense of profound disbelief and dawning horror. His grandfather wrote about the 1953 launch not as a success, but as a catastrophic, unintended breakthrough. He described the ripple in the air, the energy spike, and his terrifying hypothesis of a momentary rift in space-time. But it was the entries that followed that truly chilled Ben to the bone. "Something came through," one entry read, the handwriting slightly shaky. "Not a machine, not a weapon. It was a signal, a consciousness. I felt it, just for a moment, in the static between radio channels. It wasn't hostile. It was lost, a castaway on the shores of our time." Ben's heart hammered against his ribs. His grandfather believed they had made contact, not with an alien ship, but with a disembodied intelligence accidentally snagged from some other point in space-time and pulled into their reality. This castaway, as he called it, had imprinted itself onto the local electromagnetic field, becoming a ghost in the machine of the White Sands facility. The journals detailed his grandfather's secret attempts to communicate with the entity. He described building strange, makeshift devices in his basement, trying to isolate the signal from the background noise of the world. He wrote of fleeting moments of success, of receiving fragmented images and sounds through his equipment, glimpses of a reality utterly alien to their own. Then the tone of the entries shifted. His grandfather wrote of the entity's nature. It didn't experience time linearly, as humans do. It perceived all moments at once, and its presence was beginning to affect the local timeline. The small glitches, the moments of temporal distortion, his grandfather had predicted them decades ago. He called them echoes, the inevitable side effect of a being that existed outside the normal flow of time. Ben felt a cold dread creep over him as he connected the 70-year-old writings to the strange events unfolding in Alamogordo. The looping conversations, the stuttering broadcasts, the clocks jumping forward and back. They weren't just glitches. They were the echoes of the castaway, a lonely ghost still haunting the desert, its very existence causing the reality of their small town to fray at the edges. He closed the journal, the dusty silence of the attic suddenly feeling heavy with the weight of an impossible secret. His grandfather hadn't just been a physicist, he had been the sole keeper of a truth that was now leaking out into the world. Sleep offered Ben no escape. His dreams were a chaotic jumble of his grandfather's equations and unsettling fragmented images, vast crystalline landscapes under a purple sky, a chorus of clicking, melodic sounds, and a pervasive feeling of profound loneliness. He woke up before dawn, the words from the journal echoing in his mind, a castaway on the shores of our time. He couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather hadn't just discovered the entity, he had left a responsibility, a piece of unfinished business that now fell to him. Driven by a new, urgent purpose, Ben began to search the house not as an archivist cataloging the past, but as an investigator looking for clues. He followed the cryptic diagrams in the journals, which led him to a section of the basement that had been walled off. Behind a false wall of drywall and old shelving, he found his grandfather's secret laboratory. It wasn't a modern lab. It was a chaotic symphony of analog technology from the 1950s and 60s. Oscilloscopes, reel-to-reel tape recorders, signal generators, and strange, custom-built devices with copper coils and vacuum tubes were all interconnected by a labyrinth of wires. It was the equipment of a man trying to talk to a ghost using the only language he knew, radio waves and electricity. At the center of it all was a single, modified, reel-to-reel tape machine. According to the journals, this was his grandfather's primary communication device. He believed the entity could momentarily imprint its thoughts onto magnetic tape. Ben found a box of labeled tapes, their titles cryptic: July 53, First Echo; December 55, The Images; June 61, The Warning. With trembling hands, Ben threaded the first tape, dated just a week after the initial incident. He pressed play. At first, there was only the soft hiss of empty tape. Then a sound emerged. It was faint, a series of soft clicks and ethereal bell-like tones, the same sounds from his dream. But beneath it was something else, a distorted, fragmented recording of a radio broadcast from that same week in 1953, a news report about a local town fair. The two sounds were woven together, the alien chimes seeming to interact with the human voices, twisting their meaning. It was then that the glitches in the lab started. The needles on the analog gauges began to twitch in unison with the sounds from the tape. The green line on an old oscilloscope began to form the same complex geometric patterns his grandfather had drawn in the journals. A bare light bulb flickered, not randomly, but in a clear, repeating sequence. It was Morse code. Ben's blood ran cold as he slowly deciphered the blinking light. It was a single word, repeated over and over, a warning left by his grandfather, a message to his future self, triggered by the very frequencies on the tape. The light blinked out its desperate, silent message. Listen. Dangerous. They. Watch.
The warning hung in the air of the secret lab, heavy and suffocating. Listen. Dangerous. They. Watch. Who were they? Ben's mind raced. His grandfather had clearly stumbled upon something far larger and more sinister than just a lost alien consciousness. The mention of being watched implied a hidden human element, a group aware of the castaway and actively monitoring the situation.
Driven by this chilling revelation, Ben continued to delve deeper into his grandfather's journals and the contents of the hidden lab. He found more tapes, each chronicling different stages of his grandfather's communication with the entity. Some contained garbled alien sounds, others fleeting visual impressions, blurry images of impossible structures and alien landscapes. But it was a series of meticulously organized files tucked away in a locked metal cabinet that provided the most disturbing answers. The files were labeled Project Kronos in stark, official-looking lettering. They contained classified documents, faded photographs, and detailed reports outlining a covert government initiative that began shortly after the 1953 White Sands incident. Project Kronos wasn't about weaponizing alien technology. It was about studying and containing the temporal anomalies caused by the castaway entity. The documents revealed that the energy spike during the rocket launch hadn't just opened a rift, it had also pulled something else into our timeline. Fragments of the entity's home reality. Tiny tears in the fabric of space-time that were causing the localized temporal glitches in Alamogordo. The government had been aware of this from the beginning, actively suppressing any information about the strange occurrences and monitoring Dr. Richard's research. Ben found photographs of his grandfather meeting with shadowy figures in dark suits, their faces obscured. Reports detailed the government's attempts to understand the entity's nature and to control its influence on their reality. It seemed they had even tried to communicate with it themselves, using Dr. Richards as an unwitting intermediary. The files painted a picture of a decades-long Cold War played out not against the Soviet Union, but against the unpredictable influence of a being from outside time. Alamogordo wasn't just experiencing random glitches, it was a contained zone, subtly manipulated by the government to study the temporal effects of the castaway entity. One particularly disturbing report mentioned the entity's potential for cognitive influence, the ability to subtly affect human thoughts and perceptions. This sent a fresh wave of paranoia through Ben. Were the strange dreams he'd been having a side effect of the entity's presence? Was the feeling of being watched not just a figure of speech from his grandfather's warning, but a tangible reality? As Ben pieced together the fragmented information, a terrifying picture emerged. His grandfather hadn't just made contact, he had inadvertently become a key player in a silent war being waged in the shadows, a war for the control of time itself. And now, it seemed, that war was escalating, with Alamogordo as the unwitting battlefield. Armed with the disturbing knowledge from the Project Kronos files, Ben began to look at Alamogordo with new eyes. The small, seemingly random glitches were no longer isolated incidents. They were pieces of a larger, terrifying puzzle. The town wasn't just experiencing temporal anomalies, it was existing within one. A localized pocket of distorted time, subtly manipulated by the lingering presence of the castaway entity and the watchful eyes of Project Kronos. He started talking to the townsfolk, not about aliens or time travel, but about their experiences with the strange occurrences. At first, they were hesitant, attributing their fleeting memory lapses and odd sensations to stress or overwork. But as Ben shared his own experiences and subtly guided the conversations, a pattern began to emerge. People described moments where time seemed to speed up or slow down inexplicably. Some recalled arriving at destinations sooner than their travel time should have allowed, with no memory of the missing minutes. Others spoke of tasks taking far longer than they should have, feeling as if they were wading through treacle. The looping conversations and stuttering broadcasts were more widespread than Ben initially realized, affecting everything from casual chats at the diner to important municipal communications. One elderly woman, Mrs. Abernathy, recounted a bizarre experience in her garden. She had been pruning roses one afternoon when, for what felt like a blink of an eye, the sun seemed to jump across the sky. When she looked back at her rose bushes, some of the newly formed buds had inexplicably bloomed, while others had withered and died. Hours seemed to have passed in a matter of seconds. Ben realized that the echoes were becoming more pronounced, the temporal distortions more severe. The boundaries of their controlled anomaly were weakening, or perhaps the entity was growing stronger, its influence expanding. He found a chilling entry in his grandfather's journal detailing a similar escalation in the early 1960s, a period that coincided with increased Project Kronos activity. The government, it seemed, was also aware of the growing instability. He tried contacting the number listed in the Project Kronos files, a secure line supposedly for reporting temporal anomalies. But the number was disconnected, the line dead, as if Project Kronos itself had vanished, leaving Alamogordo adrift in its temporal bubble. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Ben's shoulders. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who understood the danger they were all in. The castaway wasn't just a lost consciousness. Its presence was unraveling their reality, causing their town to skip and stutter through time. And with Project Kronos seemingly gone, it was up to him to find a way to stabilize their world, to somehow sever the connection to the entity before Alamogordo fractured completely.
Ben knew he had to understand how his grandfather had communicated with the entity. The reel-to-reel tapes and strange analog devices in the secret lab held the key. He spent days immersed in the chaotic workshop, meticulously studying the diagrams and notes in the journals, trying to decipher the principles behind his grandfather's makeshift technology. He realized his grandfather had essentially created an echo chamber, a system designed to amplify and isolate the temporal distortions caused by the entity. By focusing specific frequencies and electromagnetic fields, he could momentarily interact with the ripples in space-time, capturing the faint echoes of the castaway's thoughts and even projecting his own. The modified reel-to-reel machine wasn't just recording sounds, it was imprinting the subtle temporal fluctuations onto the magnetic tape, creating a tangible record of the entity's presence. The custom-built devices were amplifiers and filters, fine-tuning the signals to cut through the noise of their reality. Ben theorized that the increasing temporal glitches in Alamogordo were a result of the entity's signal growing stronger, or perhaps the boundaries of the government's containment field weakening, allowing the echoes to bleed more freely into their world. He needed to find a way to counteract this, to either dampen the entity's influence or somehow restabilize the temporal field around Alamogordo. His grandfather's journals hinted at a potential solution, a counter-frequency designed to disrupt the entity's connection to their timeline. But the details were fragmented, buried within complex theoretical physics and cryptic notes about the government's Project Kronos experiments. It seemed his grandfather had been on the verge of a breakthrough when his research was either shut down or he was persuaded to stop. Driven by a desperate hope, Ben began to recreate some of his grandfather's key devices, scavenging parts from the dusty lab and even venturing out to local electronics stores for components that were still available. He felt a growing sense of urgency. The temporal glitches were becoming more frequent and more severe. He witnessed a car momentarily vanish and reappear a few feet away. He heard conversations jump minutes ahead. The fabric of Alamogordo was fraying at an alarming rate. Working day and night, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of dread, Ben finally managed to assemble a crude version of his grandfather's counter-frequency emitter. It was a strange-looking device with copper coils, vacuum tubes salvaged from an old television, and a small antenna pointing towards the sky. He had no idea if it would work or what the consequences might be, but with Alamogordo teetering on the brink of temporal collapse, he knew he had to try. He had to send his own echo back into the storm. With the counter-frequency emitter humming ominously on the workbench, Ben knew he couldn't just activate it blindly. He needed to target the signal, to focus the energy where it would be most effective. His grandfather's journals provided the final, terrifying clue. The castaway entity wasn't just a passive presence, it had an anchor point, a place where its connection to their reality was strongest. That anchor was the original launch gantry at the White Sands Missile Range, the very spot where the rift had first opened 70 years ago. Getting onto an active and highly secure military base was impossible, but Ben didn't need to be there physically. His grandfather had discovered that the entire electrical and communications grid of the region acted as a resonant network. By broadcasting the counter-frequency through a powerful enough signal, he could use the existing infrastructure to deliver the payload directly to the source. There was only one place in Alamogordo with an antenna powerful enough: the old, barely solvent AM radio station KDUST, located on the outskirts of town. Under the cover of a moonless night, Ben loaded the heavy, makeshift device into the back of his grandfather's old pickup truck. Driving through Alamogordo was like navigating a dreamscape. The temporal glitches were now constant and severe. Streetlights flickered between Marin LEDs and old incandescent bulbs. Entire buildings would shimmer, momentarily replaced by the ghostly image of what stood there 50 years prior. The town was losing its temporal cohesion. He arrived at the radio station, a small, run-down building with a tall, skeletal transmission tower looming against the starry sky. The night DJ, a young man named Leo who was more interested in his phone than the broadcast, barely looked up as Ben, looking disheveled and desperate, explained that he needed to broadcast an emergency signal for a university project. He spun a fabricated story about testing atmospheric frequencies, and $100 bills sealed the deal. In the small, soundproofed broadcast booth, surrounded by vintage equipment, Ben hooked his device directly into the station's main transmitter. He took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the activation switch. He was about to send an unknown, untested energy wave through the town's entire infrastructure, aimed at a 70-year-old temporal anomaly caused by a lost alien consciousness. The potential for disaster was immense. He flipped the switch. The device powered up with a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the floor. The lights in the station flickered, and the broadcast signal, which had been playing a classic rock song, was replaced by a single, pure, high-frequency tone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the very air in the booth seemed to grow heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Outside, the tall transmission tower began to glow with a faint, ethereal blue light. Ben had sent his message. Now, he could only wait and see if the ghost in the machine would answer.
The pure tone blaring from the KDUS transmitter seemed to vibrate through the very bones of Alamogordo. For a moment, the severe temporal glitches subsided. The flickering lights stabilized. The shimmering buildings solidified. The town held its breath, caught in a fragile bubble of restored normalcy. In the broadcast booth, Ben watched the gauges on his counter-frequency emitter. They were fluctuating wildly, the energy output spiking and dropping erratically. The blue glow around the transmission tower pulsed in time with the erratic readings. It was as if the device was engaged in a silent, invisible tug-of-war. Then, the high-pitched tone began to break down. Static crackled through the speakers, and the clear signal fractured into a garbled mess of frequencies. The lights in the radio station flickered violently. Outside, the faint blue glow around the tower intensified, then dimmed, then intensified again, like a dying ember. Ben felt a surge of panic. Had he made things worse? Was the counter-frequency disrupting the containment field, unleashing the entity further? Suddenly, a different kind of sound began to bleed through the static. It was faint at first, a series of soft melodic chimes, the same ethereal tones his grandfather had recorded. But this time, there was a clarity to them, a sense of intention that had been missing before. It was as if the castaway was responding. As the chimes grew stronger, the temporal glitches in Alamogordo began to return, but in a different way. Instead of chaotic jumps and stutters, there were fleeting glimpses, a car momentarily phasing into an older model,
a store sign flickering with a name from decades past, a snatch of conversation in a vintage dialect. It was as if the town was flickering through different moments in its own history, the echoes becoming localized and less disruptive. In the broadcast booth, the air grew cold. A faint visual distortion shimmered in front of Ben, like heat rising off the asphalt, but contained within a small, defined area. Within that shimmer, he saw fleeting images, the vast, crystalline landscape from his dreams, the purple sky, and then a brief, almost subliminal flash of a single, luminous point of light. The melodic chimes reached a crescendo, and the visual distortion intensified. Ben felt a strange pull, a sense of vastness and profound loneliness washing over him. It was a fleeting connection, a glimpse into the castaway's reality, and perhaps a sense of its understanding. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The high-pitched tone from the transmitter died, replaced by the normal static of an empty broadcast. The blue glow around the tower faded completely. The air in the booth returned to its normal temperature. The erratic readings on Ben's device stabilized at a low, steady hum. Outside, Alamogordo was still dark, but the feeling of temporal instability had subsided. The fleeting glimpses into the past had ceased. An eerie calm had settled over the town, a silence that felt different from the oppressive quiet before. It was the silence after a storm, the quiet of a world that had brushed against something extraordinary and was now slowly returning to itself. The echo was fading. The night passed without further incident. Alamogordo remained without power, shrouded in a darkness punctuated only by the distant stars. But the pervasive sense of temporal instability was gone. When dawn finally broke over the desert landscape, casting long shadows across the white sands, the town awoke to a new, if still uncertain, reality. The power grid remained down, and communication lines were still fractured. But the strange glitches had ceased. Clocks kept time, conversations flowed normally, and the world felt solid again. The castaway's echoes had faded, leaving behind a subtle, almost imperceptible stillness in the air. Ben, exhausted, but with a sense of quiet accomplishment, dismantled his makeshift emitter in the radio station. Leo, the night DJ, looked at him with a mixture of awe and confusion, accepting another $100 bill without question. As Ben drove back towards his grandfather's house in the pre-dawn light, he saw people emerging from their homes, looking up at the sky with a newfound sense of wonder, or perhaps a lingering unease. He knew the castaway was still out there, somewhere beyond the veil of their reality. His grandfather's signal had not severed the connection, but perhaps it had created a new equilibrium, a way for the entity to exist without causing their timeline to unravel. The brief contact in the broadcast booth felt like a communication, a moment of shared understanding across unimaginable distances and temporal divides. The Project Chronos files remained a mystery. Had the government abandoned their monitoring? Were they aware of what had happened? Then suspected they were still watching, their silent vigilance now focused on him. He had interfered, stepped into a game far older and more complex than he could fully comprehend. As he reached his grandfather's house, bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun, Ben noticed something new. A small, delicate wildflower, one he had never seen before, had bloomed in the arid patch of earth by the front porch. Its petals shimmered with an iridescent, almost otherworldly hue. It was a tiny anomaly, a subtle reminder of the reality that lay just beneath the surface of their own. Ben knew that Alamogordo would never be quite the same. They had experienced something impossible, a brush with a reality beyond human comprehension. The silence that had settled over the town was not just the absence of the glitches. It was a silence filled with the weight of a shared secret, a collective memory of a night when time itself had seemed to bend. He looked out towards the white sands in the distance, the stark beauty of the desert now holding a deeper, more profound meaning. The echoes of white sands were not just a thing of the past. They were a part of their present, a constant reminder of the vast, mysterious universe that lay just beyond their perception. And in the quiet stillness of the New Mexico morning, Ben Richards knew that their story was far from over. It had simply entered a new, uncertain chapter.